Welcome into The Pulse, where we're talking all things people, power, and politics, including the right to vote. But should it be more than that? Should it be mandatory? We'll take a look at what you're saying about the idea of making it the law to cast your ballot, plus using the death penalty to get the country's fentanyl crisis under control. The reaction Donald Trump's remarks are getting from Michigan Attorney General. Those stories in a moment. But first, Donald Trump once again doubling down on his remarks about Detroit. You may remember last week, while in Detroit, he said the rest of the country would look like the city under a Kamala Harris presidency. Today, while addressing the economic club in Chicago, he talked about the auto industry and Detroit's comeback, or according to him, the lack thereof. Take a listen.
I've been talking about for the last year about Detroit and how horribly it has been. You know, it's just horrible because we've been talking about Detroit's coming back for 40 years and it's never come back.
Well, despite those remarks, Trump is coming back to Detroit this week. On Friday, he'll be hosting a rally at Huntington Place. Doors open at 3 p.m. with the event set for 7 p.m. Tickets are available online. And by the way, we are putting in a request to the Trump campaign to talk to him when he comes back into town here on The Pulse. Stay tuned. In the meantime, Vice President Harris in Detroit today, who we also, by the way, are putting many requests in to speak to. You know, she's using, once again, a less traditional means to get her message out there. She had a radio town hall with Charlemagne Dagad, where she took questions on everything from her record as prosecutor in police brutality to an issue that's plagued her throughout the campaign, the border.
We did a number of things, including what we did to try and get that border security bill passed. And then also an executive order that has actually reduced significantly the number of illegal crossings and tightened up what needs to happen in between ports of entry. But no, we've been working on it ever since. But
so what went wrong?
Here's what has to happen. Congress has to act.
VP Harris has 5 more stops scheduled in our state this week. 5. She'll be in Grand Rapids on Thursday. She'll start the day in Beer City, USA. And then she'll be heading east on I-96, hitting Lansing and then Oakland County, and capping it all off with a stop in Detroit on Saturday. And as both presidential candidates continue to make stops here in Michigan, a new poll by AARP has Kamala Harris and Donald Trump virtually tied in our state. In fact, according to the study, Trump has a 1-point lead with voters 50 and older right now, while Kamala leads among those 65 and up, I should say the VP. They also found Harris leads with women above 50, while Trump is favored by men. When it comes to participation, a whopping 90% of voters 50 and up say they're extremely motivated to cast a ballot. That's higher than any other age group. Well, today, early voting kicked off in Utah and the battleground state of Georgia. Another swing state opening early voting this week is North Carolina. Both of the southern states are still recovering from hurricane damage from Helene and, of course, Milton. However, clerks and election officials say they're still receiving ballots in the mail and that election security is being maintained. More than 40 states, including Michigan, are offering early voting. And while voting here in the U.S. is voluntary, many countries have actually policies in place that require citizens to cast their ballot. It's something that has researchers here thinking. In fact, former Presidents Trump and Obama may actually agree on something here. President Obama suggested it in 2015, and President Trump suggested it this year. Researchers looked at existing data and found compulsory voting laws noticeably boost election participation levels. And while some countries like Australia will fine you for not voting, or in Brazil, you can't renew your passport if you don't take part, researchers said even if there aren't actual punishments for people who skip the polls, the mandates still work.
Enforced compulsory voting increases turnout by as much as 15 to 20 percentage points. Unenforced compulsory voting, that is where non-voters are unlikely to have some sort of penalty for not voting, increases turnout by as much as 10 percentage points.
Well, a couple of other notes here. Dr. Singh, who you just heard from there, says the research also indicates these policies can help with racial disparities when it comes to voter turnout rates. But there's this, too. A mandate can also trigger an uptick in voters casting blank ballots just to follow the rules and avoid any fines. Well, this is a show about people, and voting is something that directly affects all of us. So we wanted to know what you think. Should voting be a requirement in the U.S.? Here's what some of you told us here in Metro Detroit.
Absolutely. It should be I think, like a national holiday for us to have an election day so we can have off and we can vote. So then it's no excuse for people to not be able to go out and vote, especially since it's free.
If you're able-bodied, I think it maybe should. I don't know. I've never really thought about that, so I don't have a strong opinion, but my gut instinct is yes.
Yes. Why? It's their obligation and duty to vote.
Should be. Because again, I feel the same. It's their duty to do that for their country, so they should do it.
I don't think so. I think that people should have the option to make the decision that they want to make.
No. I think that should be something that, being in a democratic society, nobody should be forced to do anything like that. They should have a choice to vote or not vote, regardless of the consequences.
We also posted the question on our website, fox2detroit.com, and right now most of you are actually saying yes, it should be required. But it's pretty close, as you see here, by this vote. Remember, this is not a scientific poll, but if you want to take part in this conversation, just scan that QR code at the bottom right of your screen and talk to us. You know, with Detroit being home to the Big Three, we're pretty familiar with them, and now new data is showing unions are getting a lot stronger. It comes as a number of strikes continue across the country, including at Boeing. Today, the National Labor Relations Board said the number of petitions to unionize actually jumped 29% in the past year and has doubled since the start of the Biden administration. Union members on picket lines have seen victories in the last few years. We've reported on so many of them here. They've earned better paychecks and working conditions, but some say the rise of unions has contributed instead to inflation. They also argue working against the use of AI and automation could hold back economic growth.
I understand the unions want higher wages, and you know, we all want higher wages. That's fine. But to just basically block new technology, that's worrisome.
Now, right now, about 10% of all workers in the U.S. are union members. In Michigan, that number is just above 14%. Well, from Michigan to overseas now, tonight, American troops are on the ground to help with Israel's defense. The soldiers are there to help operate a system that will be used against ballistic missiles. It's actually the most powerful anti-missile weapon used by the U.S. military and can actually destroy those missiles from 93 miles away. However, this may be the last of this type of help Israel gets from the U.S. You see, they've been given a warning that future military aid is contingent on Israel improving the civilian situation in Gaza.
The United States needs to maintain a military and security umbrella in the Middle East because it's a volatile and violent region, and we have interests and allies there.
As the U.S. helps shore up Israel's defense, Hezbollah is launching even more strikes from Lebanon. In fact, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is getting ready to respond to Iran's large-scale attack earlier this month. The world is waiting. The White House is urging Israel not to strike Iran's oil or nuclear facilities. In fact, in a post online, Netanyahu's office said, quote, "We will listen to the opinions of the United States, but we will make our final decisions based on our national interests." Well, still ahead here on The Pulse, President Trump vowing to utilize the death penalty to curb the fentanyl crisis in the U.S.
We're going to give the death penalty to anybody sending fentanyl into this country, and that would have really solved a lot of the problem.
The reaction those comments are getting from our state's attorney general and a conservative black pastor who has prayed with President Trump and spoke at the RNC. You're watching The Pulse on Fox 2. Welcome back to The Pulse, where we focus on all things people, power, and politics. Right now, we're focusing on comments made by President Trump during his visit to Detroit last week, not where he dissed the city itself, but where he called for the death penalty in some cases in connection to fentanyl-related crimes. Joining us to discuss this tonight, Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, who put out a tweet that's gotten a lot of traction, or an X post, I guess is what you call it, not a tweet, basically saying, look, this is dangerous because the number of people that would be affected if this was to come true would be a large number. But let's just frame this for you. The former president made the remarks in Detroit at the Detroit Economic Club saying the majority of fentanyl enters the U.S. through Mexico, and he praised China's death penalty policy for drug dealers, which he claims could be a model for solving the crisis in the U.S. Mr. Trump says a lot of things, 200% tariff on goods. But you talk to his chief economist and they'll say, no, that's just a superlative. It's a way to frame something. Do you believe that this is something he's serious about?
Well, we know that it's something he's serious about because, remember, he used to be president. And so we can just look at what happened during that time period. Over the last 60 years, we've only had 16 federal executions. 13 were in 2020 alone. He executed 3 people just in the last week that he was in office. So I think he's very serious about this. It's not something that he's just said one time. He says it over and over again. And what makes it so frightening is the way that he has phrased it is he wants to eliminate a lot of the due process considerations and also shorten the time period for appeals. And the thing that we know about the death penalty is, first of all, not everyone is properly convicted, but you can't undo the death penalty once it's been carried through. The other thing that we know about it, though, is that it disproportionately impacts young men of color. So we're talking about Latinos and black men that are disproportionately given the death penalty, when they're compared to other groups of people.
But when you look at former President Trump's comments and you say that these are the things that he could do, there are guardrails in place. I mean, you can't just, look at how difficult it is to do an execution. So many stays over and over again. There are court systems in place. There are guardrails in place. Should we really be worried about this, or do you think this feels like more of an election type scare? Many people say that.
Well, what we know is even though historically, or I should say at least in the last few decades, the death penalty has not been utilized where there's not an associated murder case or homicide. Usually that's the only time that it can be used, and there's actually a Supreme Court opinion on that back from 2008. But technically speaking, absent that opinion, the federal law does permit this to happen, and I think that with the judges that Trump has put on the court, I think it's likely that that would be reversed. What that would allow for is literally thousands of people that have narcotics trafficking related offenses to be executed, and I think he absolutely means it, that he wants to move forward on it. The other thing I'll say is that when Jeff Sessions was his attorney general back in 2018, I think it was, he issued a memorandum to the Department of Justice as well as to all the U.S. attorneys' offices, calling on them to start requesting death sentences on narcotics trafficking cases. So when he says it, it's not just that we should believe him, but he's already implemented that policy when he's been in office before.
But we know what the law is. Right now, the death sentence can only be handed down for murder, treason, genocide, the killing or kidnapping of a congressperson, the president, or Supreme Court justice. Drug trafficking notably is not a capital offense. So for him to try to move mountains to make that happen would take more than an act of Congress, quite literally, but it would actually take a lot of guardrails to be moved out of place, wouldn't you think?
Well, it does mean that you would have to have rulings from the federal courts. But again, we have seen, historic rulings like Roe v. Wade. After 50 years of having, reproductive rights in the United States.
Sure.
That was done away with very quickly, and I do believe with the numbers that we see on the Supreme Court right now, I think it's really setting things up for a precedent-setting case that would overturn those prior opinions.
There's the Trump campaign has come out over and over again and said when it comes to helping black Americans, Trump, while in office, did a lot, including the First Step Act, which actually marks this moment in history for criminal reform that says, look, we're going to reverse the effects of that 1994 crime bill that Biden had voted for, which, the Predator bill. A lot of people were very critical of Joe Biden back then when he helped pass that bill. And this First Step Act helped kind of move some of those things away and helped black Americans to decriminalize so much of what they were dealing with. Do you feel like perhaps there's some credence to that?
I really don't. And what I've seen time and time again from not just from Trump, but from the people that he has placed into positions of great authority in the justice system is, time and again, he is vilifying and demonizing people of color in general, but especially black men. I mean, whether it's the Central Park Five, which he continues to this day, he will not concede that these people were actually innocent of the crimes of which he insisted that they received the death penalty for. Whether it's the fact that he's constantly denigrating, cities like Detroit because, it's always Baltimore or Detroit or some city or country that is, majority, black or people of color. Even some of his remarks about the vice president questioning her, how authentic it was that, that she's biracial and she's black.
Back to the reform, when you hear the Trump campaign say, look, that First Step Act that we had in place did a lot to reduce the federal prison population, to make sure that we're making sure that reentry programs have the money they need for young people in black cities like Detroit. They made those investments, and so they're asking, of course, hey, shouldn't we fairly be thought of as being a fair administration when we did all of that? That act did a lot to help, didn't it?
I would say that the reforms that Kamala Harris put in place while she was not just San Francisco district attorney, but also as Attorney General of the state of California, I mean, leaps and bounds further than anything that Trump did when he was in office for the residents of her state. And she was one of the first people to start coming up with those programs that are the reentry programs that involve education and job training and housing and things to make sure that you are driving down the recidivism rate. And if anybody knows about criminal justice reform, I really think that it's Kamala Harris who has worked so hard and been dedicated in that area.
She's been opposed to the death penalty in the past, but this campaign, the DNC as per large and really as a forum, they have not really come out against the death penalty. Do you wish they would maybe speak out against it at this time?
Well, what Kamala Harris said was this. When she was district attorney, she did not request the death penalty. When she was Attorney General, she said she would enforce the law and that she would defend the cases where someone had already been sentenced to death, as was her job. But, she certainly does not support these kinds of policies that would result potentially, again, in thousands of people being sentenced to death. And, in addition to that, I mean, if you look at the numbers, 40% of those people are first-time offenders. Over 80% of those people are American citizens. I think there is, some sort of misconception that we're talking about people that come from other countries when, for the very most part, that's not true.
Attorney General, I want to say thank you for your time. We're out of time for this particular segment, but we appreciate you coming on the show to tell us your perspective on this very important issue. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
Attorney General Dana Nessel. We'll continue this conversation on the other side of the break, speaking with a local pastor, a conservative man, about his thoughts on Trump's reactions. You're watching The Pulse on Fox 2. Welcome back to The Pulse. The election is just 20 days away now, and both candidates are making a lot of campaign stops. And remarks made by former President Trump here in Detroit are hitting a nerve with a lot of people. Joining us with the other side of our conversation regarding the drugs and death penalty comments, Pastor Lorenzo Sewell. Good to see you. Pastor, you prayed with the president. You are a supporter. You've spoken at the RNC, rather. What do you think about his comments that he made about China's approach to considering using the death penalty in drug trafficking?
We have a problem because of the immigration crises up under Vice President Harris and President Biden's policies. We have fentanyl in our communities, and at least the president has a practical solution to this very complex problem. The Bible says the lawless have to worry about the law. The Bible also says those who have the power to control the law, they have the sword for a reason, right? So we as a people should at least be looking at a leader that has a solution for this extremely complex problem.
Pastor, you mean to tell me that you think it's a practical solution to institute the death penalty for drug trafficking?
Does fentanyl kill people?
Yes, it does. But I'm asking you if you think that this should be a capital offense. We know what a capital offense is: murder, treason, genocide, killing of a congressperson, a president. This equates to the same thing: someone going down the wrong road, becoming a drug dealer, inadvertently, of course, hurting other people, or advertently. But at the end of the day, you believe that that is a capital offense, and that should be something that is a practical solution, should be the death penalty.
I was a street pharmacist. I was a former street pharmacist, so I know what it means to get trapped in the plight and the plane of drug dealing. I understand that fentanyl can kill people. I do believe that we, the people, should look at every angle of this idea to make sure that each state has a solution. I do believe that it is being suggested by the Attorney General that this is a black problem, but it's not a black problem. This is an epidemic that's happening all throughout the country, and to suggest that this is something that's going to disproportionately touch black men, I believe that that's a racist idea.
Well, I think the latest statistics, something like closer to 38% of those who were incarcerated with these types of charges may have been African American. The rest of them, as you suggest, not necessarily black, but also people perhaps of color and also white people. But let's take all the color out of this and talk about policy. When you hear former President Trump praising China's idea of a death penalty for drug trafficking, is that just a Trumpian quote that he puts out there at rallies and at economic club meetings, but he's not serious about it? Or do you believe that he really is serious about that?
I believe that leaders lead, and leaders bring forth ideas. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best idea. It means that it starts the conversation. Other people chime in like you and I are chiming in right now. So I do believe at least a leader is leading and putting forth an idea.
So when he says things like 200% tariff on these products, which would drive up the cost of the products, one of his former architects of his economic plan in 2016, Steve Moore, told the Pulse, hey, you know what? You can't take it literally. Former President Trump is just speaking in superlatives because he's trying to get a point across. Do you think that's the right way to campaign?
I believe that we have a problem as it pertains to being ripped off by other nations. And I do believe that President Trump is the only president that had a very practical solution in terms of tariffs. Now, the percentage, obviously, that can be debated. The same thing with the death penalty. Sometimes it can be hyperbole, but at least we are having a conversation because we're being affected by having things imported into our country where we're not getting our fair share.
And I understand what you're saying. Look, the border crisis is exactly that. No one can deny that, whether you're blue or red. There are people right here in Metro Detroit who have lost children because of this.
Absolutely.
Both candidates should be admitting that, and they are, and talking about it. But my question to you is, when you talk about repentance and you talk about second chances, and when you stand up at the pulpit and say that, and then we have a candidate who's talking about perhaps imposing a death penalty, that doesn't seem like it kind of steps in line with what you would be talking about or preaching.
You know, the Attorney General made mention of all the things that President Trump did wrong in terms of the death penalty. But what about all the people he's released? What about our former mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick? He released him, so he gave him a second chance. What about how you talked about the First Step Act? That's a second chance.
Sure.
We know that his actions have been actions of second chances, and I do agree with you that we all need mercy and we all need grace. My prayer is that America would also give that same grace and that same mercy to President Donald Trump, because we all have sinned and we all have fallen short of the glory of God.
So perhaps by saying things like that or imposing a death penalty for simple, I say simple, but drug trafficking, that could be, we just have to give him the grace of God and say perhaps he's just speaking in a hyperbole. I do want to ask you about the First Step Act. It was a pivotal moment for the criminal justice reform movement here, and it did reverse, in fairness, Biden's 1994 crime bill. That was a predator bill that many people criticized Biden for. He has since said that he regrets his involvement in that. But you think that we have to give pause to that?
Well, I think that every president makes mistakes.
Sure.
And I believe that when it comes to criminal justice, that we need to look at where that started. That started up under Democratic policies.
And we're going to be giving both sides to this issue, and we'll continue our conversation with you. We're out of time today on The Pulse, but thank you, Pastor Sewell, for joining us. As always, good to see you. And that does it for The Pulse for tonight. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rup Raj. Have a good night.